On the fog-choked streets of London's East End, women were being hunted. Prostitutes in the slums, alone and vulnerable. Their throats were cut, their bodies mutilated. In some cases, internal organs removed. Skillful, precise, chillingly methodical. Knowledge of anatomy or something far darker, no one knew. Between August 31st and November 9th, 1888, 5 women would fall victim. Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Known now as the Canonical 5, their murders would shock a city and terrify a world. Letters began to arrive. One signed Jack the Ripper. Another, the From Hell letter, came with half a human kidney. Messages meant to shock, to terrify, to mock. Whether confession or hoax, the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. Police struggled to find him. Witnesses were scarce, leads vanished, and the killer remained unseen, a shadow in the alleys, leaving only death and fear in his wake. The media spread every rumor, every whisper. Newspapers fed the panic, turning a string of brutal murders into a worldwide obsession. Jack the Ripper became more than a murderer. He became a symbol of terror, a mystery that would never be solved. Who was he? What drove him to such darkness? And could he still be hiding in plain sight? Long before Jack the Ripper struck, the streets of Whitechapel were a maze of desperation and decay. By the late 19th century, waves of immigrants had poured into the East End, Irish families fleeing famine, Jewish refugees escaping pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, all crowded into narrow alleys and overcrowded tenements. By 1888, nearly 80,000 people lived shoulder to shoulder, struggling to survive. Work was scarce, housing was cramped and unsanitary, disease ran rampant, and more than half of all children born here never reached their 5th birthday. The poorest resorted to anything to survive, while crime, robbery, and alcohol dependency were part of everyday life. Whitechapel's lodging houses were overflowing. Thousands paid a few pence for a coffin-like bed or clung to a rope stretched across a dormitory, a hangover, just to have somewhere to sleep for the night. Every street corner was crowded. Every alley smelled of smoke, sweat, and desperation. Social tensions ran high. Unrest, riots, and frequent clashes with police were common. Between 1886 and 1889, demonstrations erupted in the streets, and events like Bloody Sunday in 1887 showed how quickly anger could turn violent. Racism, anti-Semitism, and nativist sentiment simmered beneath the surface, feeding suspicion and fear. In this world of overcrowding and poverty, morality was often a luxury few could afford. Rumors of vice, crime, and immorality spread quickly, painting Whitechapel as a place to fear. And when terror arrived, it became all the more believable, all the more inescapable. The city teetered on the edge of panic. People whispered about dangers in every shadow, every alley, every dimly lit corner. In Whitechapel, survival was a gamble, and the odds were rarely in anyone's favor. It was a place where society's most vulnerable could vanish without a trace, and where fear itself seemed to have a pulse. The streets of Whitechapel were already dangerous, but how many victims fell to the same hand, no one could know. Between April 1888 and February 1891, 11 separate murders were investigated by the Metropolitan Police. They were catalogued as the Whitechapel murders, a string of killings that terrified London. But uncertainty lingered.
Which of these crimes were the work of a single killer? Which were the product of the East End's pervasive violence? Experts point to a distinct pattern: deep slashes to the throat, extensive mutilation of the abdomen and genital area, the removal of internal organs, and progressive facial mutilation. These marks would later define the Ripper's brutal signature. Yet not every death matched this horrifying method. On April 3, 1888, Emma Elizabeth Smith was attacked in Osborne Street. Robbed and sexually assaulted, her face bludgeoned, ear cut, and a blunt object inserted, she would die from peritonitis the following day. She claimed her attackers were 2 or 3 men, one described as a teenager. Some linked her murder to the later killings, but most historians see her death as the result of gang violence, a grim reminder of Whitechapel's chaos. Then came Martha Tabram, killed on a staircase landing at George Yard on August 7th. 39 stab wounds carved through her throat, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, and abdomen. Knife wounds struck her breasts and genitals, all but one inflicted by a right-handed attacker. The savagery and lack of clear motive drew attention. The proximity of her murder to later attacks suggested a connection, but the pattern differed. Unlike the canonical killings, Tabram had been stabbed repeatedly, not slashed. These early deaths blurred the line between random violence and the work of a singular predator. Each attack, each corpse, raised questions that remain unanswered. In Whitechapel, fear was not just about a single killer. It was about the darkness that had always lingered in the alleys, waiting for someone to exploit it. And in that darkness, one name would become eternal: Jack the Ripper. The streets of Whitechapel were already steeped in fear, but over the summer and autumn of 1888, terror would take a darker, more methodical form. 5 women would fall victim to a single predator, the murderer who would become immortalized as Jack the Ripper.
Mary Ann Nichols was the first of the canonical 5. Her body was discovered at 3:40 a.m. on Friday, August 31st, lying in Bucks Row. She had last been seen an hour earlier, walking along Whitechapel Road after leaving a common lodging house. Her throat had been slashed by 2 deep cuts, one reaching down to the vertebrae. The lower abdomen was ripped open, her bowels exposed, and several other jagged wounds carved into her sides, each inflicted in a downward thrust. 2 stab wounds to her vagina completed the horrifying scene. Nichols' murder would set the precedent for the series to come, a terrifying signature that would haunt the East End for months.
1 week later, on Saturday, September 8th, Annie Chapman was found dead near the doorway of 29 Hanbury Street. Like Nichols, her throat had been severed with precision. Her abdomen was completely cut open, her small intestines and sections of flesh placed on her shoulders. Her uterus, sections of her bladder, and parts of her vagina had been removed. An eyewitness, Elizabeth Long, reported seeing Chapman with a dark-haired man wearing a brown deerstalker hat and shabby overcoat. The man asked, "Will you?" She replied, "Yes." A fleeting glimpse, a shadow in the morning light that would never be caught. On the early morning of September 30th, 1888, the Whitechapel murders claimed 2 victims in what became known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride was discovered at 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard. Her throat had been cut in a single, precise incision, but her body bore no further mutilation, suggesting the killer may have been interrupted. Witnesses reported seeing her with a man. Descriptions varied: fair or dark, shabbily dressed or well-dressed, the truth lost in the fog of the night. Just 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square. Her throat had been cut ear to ear and her abdomen ripped open. Her intestines were placed across her body, her uterus and left kidney removed. Her face had been brutally disfigured, nose severed, cheeks slashed, eyelids cut, triangular incisions etched into her cheeks. A section of her ear was later recovered from her clothing. The post-mortem surgeon estimated the mutilations would have taken at least 5 minutes to complete, a deliberate act of terror performed in the dead of night. A bloodied apron from Eddowes was found at Golston Street, accompanied by graffiti reading, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Police feared anti-Semitic riots and washed the message away before dawn. Its connection to the murders remains unclear, but it deepened the fear gripping Whitechapel.
The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was discovered on November 9, 1888, in her single-room flat at 13 Miller's Court. Her body had been mutilated beyond recognition. Her throat was cut to the spine, her abdomen almost entirely emptied of organs. Her uterus, kidneys, and one breast were placed beneath her head. Other organs were scattered around the room, upon the bed, the bedside table, and the floor. Her heart was missing. Ashes in the fireplace suggested the killer had burned objects to illuminate the room as he committed the atrocity. The horror of Kelly's murder marked the peak of the Ripper's escalating savagery. Mary Jane Kelly is widely believed to be the final victim of Jack the Ripper. After her death, the killings, as they were known, suddenly stopped. Some believed the murderer had died. Others thought he had been imprisoned, committed to an institution, or quietly left the country. But the silence that followed did not bring peace. The Whitechapel files record 4 more deaths. On December 20, 1888, the body of 26-year-old Rose Milett was found in Clark's yard. No signs of a struggle. Police initially believed it was an accident or suicide, but faint cord marks on her neck told a different story. The jury ruled it murder. Another woman dead. Another question unanswered. In July 1889, Alice Mackenzie was killed in Castle Alley. Her throat stabbed, her carotid arteries severed. Some believed the wounds echoed the Ripper's method. Others insisted the killer was an imitator, someone hiding behind a legend. Then came something far more disturbing. In September 1889, a headless, legless female torso was found beneath a railway arch in Pinchin Street. The body had been beaten, mutilated, carefully placed. No identity, no killer, just another fragment of horror left in the East End. The final entry came in February 1891. Frances Coles was found alive beneath a railway arch, her throat cut. She died before help arrived. Her attacker may have been interrupted. A man was arrested, briefly suspected, then released. And with that, the trail went cold. Whether Jack the Ripper vanished or was never responsible for all the killings at all remains uncertain. As the legend of Jack the Ripper grew, so did the list of possible victims. Some were real, others may never have existed at all. One of the earliest names whispered was Fairy Fay, an unidentified woman supposedly found dead near Commercial Road in December 1887. But no police record exists, no body, no crime scene. Most historians now believe Fairy Fay was born from a confused newspaper report, a ghost created by fear and rumor. Other cases were far more real. In February 1888, Annie Millwood was admitted to a workhouse infirmary with multiple stab wounds to her legs and lower body. She claimed an unknown man attacked her with a knife. She survived, briefly, dying weeks later of natural causes. Some later called her the Ripper's first victim, but certainty remains out of reach. Weeks later, Ada Wilson survived a knife attack at her own doorstep,
2 stabs to the neck, a demand for money, a man who vanished into the night. Was this a failed Ripper attack, or something else entirely? Then there were cases that blurred the line between victim and myth. Annie Farmer reported a throat injury in a lodging house in 1888. Witnesses described a bloodied man fleeing the scene, but her wound was superficial, possibly self-inflicted, another story swallowed by confusion. Beyond Whitechapel, the horror took a different shape. Headless torsos appeared, first in Whitehall, then Pynchon Street. Bodies dismembered, limbs discarded. The press named it the work of a new predator, the torso killer. Police believed the methods were different, 2 killers operating in the same city at the same time. The Thames yielded body parts. Only one woman, Elizabeth Jackson, was ever identified. And then came the cases that pushed the legend beyond reason. A mutilated child in Bradford, a murdered woman in New York. Each time the same question returned. Was Jack the Ripper still killing, or had fear itself become the murderer?
Much of what police once knew about Jack the Ripper was lost forever. During the Blitz, the majority of City of London police files were destroyed, erasing vital details of one of history's most infamous investigations. What survived tells a story of relentless effort. Victorian police launched a massive manhunt across Whitechapel. Officers conducted house-to-house inquiries, questioning residents in overcrowded lodging houses and narrow alleys. Forensic material, primitive by modern standards, was carefully collected and examined. Suspects were identified, followed, questioned, and, in many cases, eliminated. More than 2,000 people were interviewed. Over 300 were investigated in detail. At least 80 were detained. It was one of the largest criminal investigations of its time. The inquiry was first led by Detective Inspector Edmund Reed of the Whitechapel Division. After the murder of Ann Nichols, experienced detectives from Scotland Yard were sent to assist, including Frederick Aberline. When the killings crossed into the City of London, a second police force joined the hunt. But the investigation suffered from internal disruption. The head of the Criminal Investigation Department was absent during the most critical weeks of the murders. To restore order, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was appointed to coordinate the case from Scotland Yard. Investigators focused on men familiar with blades, butchers, slaughterers, surgeons, physicians. Dozens were questioned. Their movements were traced, their alibis tested. Even cattle boats docking near the London docks were examined, following suspicions that the killer might arrive and leave unnoticed. No single suspect ever fit the pattern. In the end, the methods used, questioning, surveillance, elimination, mirror modern policing. And yet, despite the scale of the hunt, Jack the Ripper was never found. By September 1888, fear had spilled into the streets. With no arrest in sight, ordinary citizens of London's East End took matters into their own hands. They formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Volunteers patrolled the alleys after dark, watching for strangers, driven by frustration with police failures and by fear that the killings were strangling local businesses. The panic was no longer private, it was economic, public. The committee petitioned the government to increase the reward for the killer's capture. When that failed, they offered their own, £50, a staggering sum at the time. They even hired private detectives, re-questioning witnesses the police had already spoken to. In Whitechapel, trust in authority was fading, and the hunt for the Ripper was no longer just a police investigation. It was a community at war with the dark. By the end of October 1888, the hunt for Jack the Ripper took a darker, more analytical turn. Robert Anderson, overseeing the investigation, asked police surgeon Thomas Bond a crucial question.
Who was this man, and what kind of mind carried out these murders? Bond examined the most brutally mutilated victim himself and reviewed the post-mortem reports from the earlier killings. What he produced became the earliest surviving psychological profile of the Whitechapel murderer. Bond concluded that all 5 murders were committed by the same hand. In nearly every case, the victims' throats were cut first, swiftly, decisively, while they were already lying down. In one case, arterial blood was found splashed across the wall, silent evidence of the violence unleashed in seconds. But Bond rejected a popular belief. He did not think the killer had surgical training, nor the practiced skill of a butcher or slaughterer. Instead, he saw chaos, improvisation, and absence of technical precision. In Bond's view, this was a solitary man, someone suffering periodic attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. The mutilations, he suggested, pointed toward uncontrollable compulsions rather than calculated expertise. He considered revenge, brooding obsession, even religious mania, but dismissed them as unlikely origins. There was no proof the killer engaged in sexual acts with his victims, yet modern psychologists argue the violence itself was sexualized, the knife replacing physical intimacy, the bodies left deliberately exposed, staged in degrading positions. Others reject that interpretation entirely, calling it speculation layered upon horror. What Bond's profile truly revealed was this: Jack the Ripper was not just evading the police, he was exposing the limits of Victorian understanding of the criminal mind. And in Whitechapel, the questions were becoming as terrifying as the crimes.
As investigators mapped the murders, a pattern began to emerge. Most of the killings happened on weekends or public holidays, and all within a tight radius of Whitechapel's narrow streets. To many, this suggested a simple truth: the killer worked a regular job, lived nearby, and struck when routine loosened its grip. But not everyone agreed. Another theory took hold, darker and more unsettling: that Jack the Ripper was not a local laborer, but an educated man, possibly a doctor, perhaps even a member of the upper class, someone who slipped into Whitechapel from wealthier districts, unseen and unquestioned. These ideas reflected the fears of the age: anxiety over modern science, distrust of the medical profession, and the growing belief that the poor were being exploited, used, discarded by the powerful. Decades later, the obsession gained a name: Ripperology. Coined in the 1970s, it became a field unto itself, an endless effort to identify the man behind the murders. Books, films, novels, and theories multiplied. The Ripper transformed from a criminal into a cultural myth. And with that myth came suspects. Almost anyone loosely connected to the case has been accused: artists, writers, doctors, men never considered by police at the time, because today no one is left alive to defend themselves. Modern authors can name a killer without proof, because history can no longer answer back. Official police documents mention only a handful of suspects. Sir Melville Macnaghten's 1894 memorandum lists 3. Yet even there, the evidence is thin, entirely circumstantial. The case is further crippled by absence. Most forensic evidence is gone, destroyed, contaminated, or never preserved to modern standards. DNA testing has offered headlines, but little certainty. Claims linking a Whitechapel barber named Aaron Kosminski to the crimes have been widely criticized. The data could not be verified. The study could not be replicated. Even the Forensic Journal later issued an official warning. Other tests on letters allegedly sent by the Ripper collapsed under contamination and doubt. One letter changed everything.
Dated September 1888, the message signed "Dear Boss" mocked the police and promised more blood. When a victim was later found with part of her ear cut, the letter suddenly felt prophetic, and within its lines a name appeared for the first time: Jack the Ripper. Days later came the saucy Jackie postcard bragging about a double event. Its timing sparked debate. Was it insider knowledge or just gossip traveling fast through Whitechapel? Then came the most disturbing message of all, the From Hell letter. Sent to a local vigilante leader, it arrived with a small box. Inside, half of a human kidney preserved in alcohol. The writer claimed he had eaten the rest. Whether it belonged to a victim or was an elaborate hoax remains disputed. Police circulated copies of the letters, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting. Quietly, many officers believed the truth was simpler, that the letters weren't written by a killer at all, but by journalists. Designed to inflame fear, boost circulation, and turn a murderer into a legend. In the end, the letters did exactly that. They didn't reveal Jack the Ripper. They created him.
After everything we know, and everything we think we know, one truth remains. Jack the Ripper is less a man and more a shadow. This case isn't just unsolved because of missing evidence. It's unsolved because fear, media, and myth blurred reality from the very beginning. False letters, unreliable witnesses, destroyed files, all of it turned an investigation into a legend. My opinion? The real story isn't who Jack the Ripper was. It's how chaos, poverty, and sensationalism allowed a killer to vanish into history, while the victims were slowly forgotten. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all.